Jake Carter had never thought he'd settle into a quiet suburban neighborhood. After serving for years as a Marine, deploying in combat zones, and surviving the hell of war, he never imagined a peaceful place like this would become his sanctuary. But here he was, rolling his wheelchair down the freshly paved road in front of his new home. His faithful service dog, Rocky, trotted alongside him, tail wagging proudly. The air was crisp, with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Jake had hoped the calm suburban life would help him escape the chaos that often filled his mind. PTSD wasn't something you could just forget, but the peace of the neighborhood, the friendly faces he'd seen so far, made him hopeful. For once, he thought maybe things could feel normal again. He paused at the foot of his driveway, adjusting the straps of his military-grade wheelchair, and glanced at the house, a modest two-story home with a white picket fence. It had been a long road to get here, both literally and metaphorically. But this was his new start, a place where he could recover, reflect, and finally, after so many years, just breathe. Rocky sat beside him, sensing his moment of peace. The dog nuzzled his hand, and Jake smiled. There was something about Rocky that made everything feel a little bit more manageable. The dog had been his constant companion, his lifeline, especially on the bad days. Just as Jake was about to head inside, a woman approached from across the street. She walked with purpose, holding a clipboard in her hand. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her posture screamed authority. Jake had seen people like her before, those who had a way of making everyone feel like they were under surveillance. She stopped at the edge of the driveway, and Jake didn't need her to introduce herself. The look on her face said it all. "Good morning," she said with a tight smile. "I'm Karen Wilcox. I'm the president of the HOA here. I just wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood." Jake smiled politely, extending his hand. "Thanks. I'm Jake Carter. Just moved in a couple of days ago." Karen looked at his hand, but instead of shaking it, her gaze shifted to Rocky, who was sitting beside Jake. Her eyes narrowed. She cleared her throat, straightening her posture. "Well, Mr. Carter, we like to keep things very orderly around here," she said, scanning the yard with a hawk-like eye. "Our community prides itself on maintaining a certain aesthetic, you see. We have a set of guidelines for how homes should be maintained. We'll be sending you a copy." Jake raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. Something about Karen's tone made it clear she wasn't exactly offering him a warm welcome. "And I trust you're aware of our pet policies," Karen continued, her voice stiff. "No pets that cause disturbances. No more than 2 animals per household. I do hope Rocky isn't a problem." Jake wasn't one to shy away from standing up for himself, but he bit his tongue. He could already feel where this conversation was headed. "He's a service dog, ma'am," Jake said calmly, keeping his voice steady. "Not a pet." Her expression hardened, but she quickly recovered, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "I'm aware of that," Karen replied, but her tone made it clear she didn't care for the idea of exceptions to her rules. "However, the HOA guidelines still apply. I'll send you the official documents just to make sure we're all clear." With that, she turned on her heel and walked back across the street, leaving Jake with a knot forming in his stomach. He had been through much worse than this, but something about Karen's attitude rubbed him the wrong way. He had hoped for peace, but it seemed like he might have just stepped into another kind of battlefield. As Jake wheeled himself inside his new home, Rocky followed closely behind. He glanced at the dog, whose eyes seemed to say, "We've got this, Jake. We're not backing down." Jake smiled. Maybe this neighborhood wasn't going to be as peaceful as he hoped. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Karen Wilcox, mess with his new life. The following week, Jake received an envelope in the mail that looked official. It was neatly addressed in bold, crisp lettering, HOA notice of violation. His heart sank. He hadn't expected to receive something like this so soon, especially not after the brief encounter with Karen. Opening the envelope, Jake unfolded the letter, reading each word carefully. "Dear Mr. Carter, we are writing to inform you that your property is currently in violation of HOA guidelines. Specifically, your front lawn has not been maintained to the community standards outlined in our homeowner agreement. This includes a lack of properly trimmed shrubs and the unapproved installation of a wheelchair ramp. Please be advised that you have 7 days to bring your property into compliance or face a fine of $100 per day. We appreciate your immediate attention to this matter." Jake's hand trembled slightly as he finished reading the letter. The words unapproved installation of a wheelchair ramp struck him like a punch to the gut. The ramp wasn't even finished yet. It was still in the process of being built. It was a necessity, not a decoration, but to Karen and the HOA, it might as well have been a crime. He stared at the letter for a few moments, his mind racing. The ramp was the one thing that gave him the independence he had fought so hard to reclaim. Now, it was being treated like some sort of eyesore, something that violated the sacred aesthetic of the community. He couldn't believe it. His fingers brushed over the embossed HOA logo at the top of the letter. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was starting to feel like the world was stacking the odds against him. Not again, Jake muttered to himself. He had faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. It felt personal. The next morning, Jake sat down with a pen and paper. He wasn't about to let this slide. He knew that the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, guaranteed his right to have the ramp. The law couldn't be bent by HOA bylaws, no matter how high and mighty they felt. Jake reached out to an old military buddy who was a lawyer, asking for advice. His friend, Dave, was an attorney who specialized in civil rights, and he had seen his fair share of discriminatory cases in the past. "I'll look into it," Dave assured him over the phone. "But don't worry, Jake. You're not alone in this." That gave Jake some comfort, but not much. He needed to be proactive. He drafted a response to the HOA letter, explaining the situation in detail. He included a copy of his VA identification, a letter from his doctor confirming the need for the ramp, and a section of the ADA that guaranteed people with disabilities the right to reasonable accommodations. Jake walked down the street with Rocky at his side, carrying his response letter in hand. He was about to give it to Karen in person. She was going to hear his side of the story, whether she liked it or not. He reached Karen's house just as she was trimming her lawn, with her perfect white apron and gardening gloves on, as if she were some kind of suburban queen maintaining her kingdom. "Ms. Wilcox," Jake called out as he rolled up to her yard. Karen looked up, startled, before her stern expression returned. "Mr. Carter, what brings you by?" she asked, her voice already dripping with annoyance. "I wanted to personally hand you my response to the violation notice," Jake said, holding up the letter. "I don't think you fully understand the situation here. This ramp is necessary for my mobility. It's not an unsightly modification. It's essential for my independence." Karen's lips curled into a tight smile. "I'm afraid the guidelines don't care about your needs. It's about maintaining property values and the overall look of the neighborhood." Jake's eyes narrowed. "What about the law? What about the ADA? I've spoken to my lawyer. The ramp is protected under federal law. You can't just ban it because it doesn't match your idea of aesthetic harmony." Karen's eyes flickered with annoyance, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Carter. But as I said before, the rules are the rules." Jake's voice grew firmer. "I'm not asking you for permission, Karen. I'm telling you that I'm within my rights to have this ramp. And if you try to find me again or take further action, I'll see you in court." Karen's lips tightened, and for a brief moment, Jake saw something other than coldness in her eyes, fear. But it was quickly replaced by that same self-righteous glare. "We'll see about that," Karen said, and without another word, she turned and walked back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Jake exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Jake knew the HO wasn't going to back down that easily. They had power, and Karen was used to getting her way. Sure enough, a few days later, another letter arrived, but this time it was far worse than the first. "Final notice, immediate action required." Jake opened the letter carefully, already preparing himself for the worst. The tone of the letter was much harsher this time, threatening immediate legal action and increasing the fine to $500 per day for every day the ramp remained on the property. They also added a note that implied the HOA would take Jake to court if he didn't comply. The letter finished with a chilling warning. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in an escalation of fees and the potential involvement of local authorities. Jake's heart sank. He knew the HOA had resources, and if they went to court, the legal fees would pile up fast. But he couldn't back down. His rights were on the line, and he wasn't about to let Karen and her petty rules push him out of his own home. With clenched fists, Jake took a deep breath and called his attorney, Dave, again. "I'm not going to remove the ramp, Dave," Jake said, his voice steady but determined. "They're threatening to take me to court, and I need to know what to do next." Dave's voice was calm but firm on the other end. "Jake, don't worry. The law is on your side. We'll file a motion and we'll take them to court if we need to. But I want to gather all the evidence we can before we move forward. Make sure you keep any correspondence from them, and we'll start preparing the case." Jake nodded to himself, feeling a surge of determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for anyone who needed help but was too afraid to stand up. The next week, the HOA scheduled an emergency meeting to address Jake's ramp issue. Karen, of course, was leading the charge. Jake rolled into the meeting room early, determined to make his voice heard. The large room was filled with neighbors, some of whom were curious about what was going on, while others seemed entirely uninterested. A few gave Jake sympathetic glances, while others, like the elder Mr. and Mrs. Carson, avoided his eyes completely. Karen stood at the front of the room, smug as ever, with her arms crossed and a stern look on her face. She was already prepared for a fight. "Mr. Carter," Karen began, addressing Jake directly, "you've clearly ignored all our attempts to resolve this issue. It seems you're more interested in making a spectacle of yourself than in being a considerate member of this community." Jake's voice rang out, calm but unwavering. "I'm not here to make a spectacle, Karen. I'm here to fight for my rights, rights that are protected by federal law." He handed over his legal papers, including a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as well as his attorney's formal letter stating the HOA was in violation of the law. Karen's face paled slightly as she scanned the papers. She stood there for a moment, looking at the other board members, who were growing visibly uncomfortable. The silent tension in the room was palpable. She knew the law wasn't on her side. "This is irrelevant," Karen said, trying to assert dominance, but her voice cracked. "We are not bound by federal law here. These are our guidelines, and they're designed to protect the value and integrity of the community." Jake stood his ground. "If your guidelines break federal law, Karen, they're worthless. You cannot discriminate against me because of my disability." The room fell silent. For the first time, Karen seemed unsure of herself. She opened her mouth to argue, but one of the other board members, Mrs. Parker, interrupted. "I think it's time we hear from a legal expert," Mrs. Parker said, her voice soft but firm. "We can't just ignore the law." Karen flushed with frustration. "You're all going to let him walk all over us?" Jake looked directly at the board members. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one in this community is treated unfairly or made to feel less than because of their disability." Over the following days, the story of Jake's battle with the HOA spread throughout the neighborhood. Some of the residents, previously quiet and hesitant, began to voice their support. They saw what was happening, an unfair attack on a disabled veteran, someone who had served his country, all because of a ramp. A local news station caught wind of the controversy and picked up the story. The next morning, a camera crew arrived at the neighborhood, filming Jake as he spoke about the importance of the ramp for his mobility and independence. The coverage drew widespread attention. On social media, residents began to share their thoughts, many of them criticizing the HOA for their discriminatory actions. "I can't believe this is happening in our community," one comment read. "A veteran is being harassed for having a ramp. What happened to kindness and understanding?" Another comment said, "I've lived here for years and never thought I'd see something like this. It's time for Karen to step down." Karen, seething with anger, saw her carefully curated image of the neighborhood as a pristine, exclusive haven begin to crumble. Neighbors who had once agreed with her now began to question her motives. Some even approached Jake, offering their support, though they remained hesitant to speak out publicly due to fear of retaliation. In an effort to regain control of the situation, Karen called for yet another emergency HOA meeting. This time, her agenda was to push through a new rule that would restrict the installation of any exterior modifications, including wheelchair ramps, unless approved by the HOA. Of course, Karen made sure to include herself in the approval process as the president. But this time, Jake was ready. He came to the meeting with support from the community, and his attorney was there, ready to confront Karen's underhanded tactics. "This new rule you're proposing is a direct violation of the ADA," Jake's attorney, Dave, said, standing up in front of the board. "If you pass this, you will be facing a lawsuit, and it won't just be Jake who will be affected. It'll be the entire HOA." The board members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging uncertain glances. Karen's face twisted with fury, but she didn't have the power she once had. The truth was out, and she was losing her grip on the neighborhood. With Karen's desperation growing, Jake's attorney, Dave, made it clear that if the HOA didn't immediately withdraw their unconstitutional rules, a lawsuit would be filed. At this point, Karen could see the writing on the wall. She was losing control, but she wasn't one to go down without a fight. She immediately began gathering support from some of the more influential members of the HOA, trying to rally them around her vision of neighborhood aesthetics. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted. Jake's legal team had already filed a formal lawsuit against Karen and the HOA for discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The press picked up the story once again, and the media's attention on the case intensified. The spotlight shone brighter than ever on Karen's cruelty. Her words and actions were now scrutinized by the public, and the more she tried to defend herself, the worse it became. Jake stood tall, his confidence bolstered by the support he received from neighbors and the legal certainty backing him. He wasn't just fighting for his own right to have a wheelchair ramp. He was fighting for others with disabilities who might be intimidated by the HOA's overreach. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Karen's facade cracked under the pressure. Her former supporters started to see through her, and some even publicly called her out. In a particularly dramatic moment, Karen tried to stage a public speech at a neighborhood event. Standing in front of a crowd of residents, she attempted to portray herself as the victim in this situation. "I've been trying to protect the value of our community," Karen said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But now I'm being unfairly vilified for doing my job. They're trying to destroy everything we've worked for." The crowd was silent, waiting for someone to speak up. Then one brave neighbor, Mr. Jefferson, stood and raised his hand. "Karen, you're not protecting anything. You've been discriminating against a disabled veteran," Mr. Jefferson said, his voice steady and calm. "You've crossed the line. The community is behind Jake. Maybe it's time for you to step down." Karen's face turned bright red with rage. She tried to respond, but the murmurs from the crowd drowned her out. Neighbors who had been quiet now began speaking up, voicing their disgust with her behavior. "Enough is enough, Karen," another neighbor called out. For the first time, Karen realized that the people she had once controlled were no longer afraid to speak up. A few weeks later, the day in court arrived. The courtroom was packed with media, neighbors, and legal professionals. Karen's smug confidence had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, almost nervous energy. Jake, on the other hand, sat calm and resolute beside his attorney. He knew the truth was on his side, and now it was time to expose the HOA's discriminatory actions once and for all. When the trial began, Karen's lawyer made an attempt to argue that the HOA's aesthetic policies were not discriminatory and that Jake's ramp violated those policies. But Jake's attorney, Dave, immediately objected, laying out the facts of the case. He cited federal law, presenting evidence that the ADA clearly protected Jake's right to install the ramp. "Your Honor, the law is clear. No private entity, including the HOA, has the right to enforce rules that discriminate against a disabled individual," Dave stated. "This ramp is a necessity, not an aesthetic decision. And the HOA is infringing on my client's rights under federal law." The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience, listened intently, shaking her head as Karen's lawyer stammered. There was no room for argument when it came to federal rights, especially not when the case was so clear-cut. Karen, desperate and cornered, tried to salvage the situation with a last-ditch effort. "But, Your Honor, the ramp is an eyesore. It's a safety hazard. Think of the other homeowners and the property values." Jake's attorney turned to the judge and said, "There's no evidence to suggest the ramp has harmed property values. In fact, we have a number of neighbors who are willing to testify that they are proud to support Mr. Carter and his right to have the ramp. It's about inclusivity, not aesthetics." The judge leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Ms. Thornton, it's clear your actions have violated federal law. You may have made decisions based on aesthetics, but you cannot override the rights of a disabled individual in this community." Karen's face drained of color. She had no comeback. Her defense had crumbled. After a few tense moments of deliberation, the judge returned to the bench with a verdict. "Having reviewed all the evidence and heard both sides of the argument, I find in favor of Mr. Jake Carter," she announced. "The HOA's actions in banning the wheelchair ramp are in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The HOA is hereby ordered to allow Mr. Carter to keep the ramp. Additionally, the HOA must pay for all legal fees associated with this case. Furthermore, the actions of Karen Thornton were discriminatory and harmful, and she will personally be fined for her behavior." The courtroom erupted into applause. Jake's neighbors cheered, and even some of the previously quiet board members looked visibly relieved. Karen, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, her face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. She had failed. The verdict sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The HOA quickly convened a special meeting, and Karen was immediately removed from her position as president. It was clear to everyone that her actions had not only caused immense legal trouble, but had also fractured the trust of the entire community. Neighbors who had once followed her lead now realized that Karen's obsession with control and power had endangered their entire community. Many even called for the HOA to be overhauled, with new leadership that prioritized fairness and respect for all residents. Karen, now persona non grata in the community, was ostracized. She could no longer manipulate the HOA's rules for her own benefit, and the support she once had crumbled completely. Her influence evaporated as she faced the legal and social consequences of her actions. Jake, on the other hand, had won more than just the right to keep his ramp. He had restored justice in his neighborhood. As word spread about the case, his neighbors rallied behind him, offering support and admiration. Some even began to take steps to make their homes more accessible, adding ramps and other modifications in solidarity. The HOA, now under new leadership, worked to revise its policies, ensuring that they would never again discriminate against residents with disabilities. Jake had not only stood up for his rights, but had also set a precedent for a more inclusive and compassionate community. He became an advocate for disabled rights, offering advice and support to others who face similar challenges. His battle had shown the neighborhood what real community spirit looked like. As for Karen, her downfall was swift. Faced with the shame of her actions and the legal fees, she sold her house and moved away. She left the neighborhood, never to return, a bitter reminder of what happens when power is abused. The community, once divided, now stood united. Karen had tried to divide them, but in the end, it was her actions that led to her complete isolation. Jake, on the other hand, was now regarded as a hero, someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. And as for the ramp, it stayed, a symbol of victory and a reminder that justice, even in the face of adversity, would always prevail.